A squirrel in your yard just looked directly at you. Not a glance, not the quick peripheral awareness of an animal that has registered motion and is evaluating whether it represents a threat. A direct, deliberate look, the orientation of the squirrel's entire face toward your face, the eyes moving from what the squirrel was doing to where you are, the moment of recognition that happens in a single second. And in that single second, everything the squirrel is doing changes. The foraging becomes more urgent, or it stops entirely. The movement becomes either more careful or more bold depending on what the squirrel's assessment of your gaze means. The entire behavioral profile shifts because the squirrel has just determined something crucial. It is being watched, and it knows it is being watched, and it is now calculating what that means for what happens next. You may have thought the squirrel did not notice you. You may have believed your watching was invisible, that you could observe the squirrel without affecting the squirrel, that the animal's behavior was authentic and unmodified by your presence. But the moment the squirrel looked at you and you understood that you had been seen, something more significant happened. The squirrel did not simply notice you. The squirrel recognized that you had been noticing it. And everything shifted. Welcome back to Hidden Backyard Wildlife, the channel where we sit with the small wild lives that share our yards and try to understand what they understand about the world. If you are new here, make sure you subscribe before this video is over, because what you are about to learn is going to permanently change the way you watch squirrels. Because you will finally understand that the moment you think you are seeing a squirrel behaving naturally is precisely the moment the squirrel knows it is being observed and is no longer behaving naturally at all. Today we are walking through 8 things squirrels do the moment they realize you are watching them. What each of those behaviors reveals about the extraordinary self-awareness of an animal that most people never think of as having an awareness of being watched, and why the squirrel that appears to be oblivious to your presence is actually constantly aware of your presence and constantly modifying its behavior in response to your attention. Stay with me from beginning to end because observation number 6 is the one that reveals how sophisticated the squirrel's awareness of being watched actually is. And observation number 8 is the one that will completely change your understanding of what it means when a squirrel looks directly at you. She knows you are watching. She has always known. And what she does with that knowledge is far more complex than you have ever realized. The first thing that happens the moment a squirrel realizes it is being watched is a subtle but immediate change in movement quality. The squirrel does not stop moving entirely. Instead, the movement becomes more deliberate, more economical, less frenetic. Before the moment of recognition, a foraging squirrel moves with a particular quality of urgency and distraction. The movement of an animal whose attention is distributed between the task at hand and the constant background threat monitoring that prey animals engage in continuously. The squirrel is searching for acorns or seeds, but a portion of its cognitive attention is always allocated to threat detection. But the moment the squirrel recognizes that it is being watched, that a specific threat, you, is not just present but is attending to the squirrel specifically, the movement quality changes. The urgency decreases. The movement becomes more economical. The squirrel is no longer simply foraging while monitoring for threat. The squirrel is now displaying, consciously or unconsciously, a version of its behavior that it has calculated is safe to display in the presence of an observer. Researchers studying vigilance behavior in tree squirrels have found that squirrels demonstrate measurable changes in movement speed and foraging efficiency when direct observation is occurring, with observed squirrels showing reduced movement speed and increased movement precision compared to the same squirrels when they believe they are unobserved. She has seen you see her, and the first thing she does is slow down. The urgency decreases. The movement becomes more controlled. She is no longer moving like an animal that believes it is unobserved. She is moving like an animal that knows exactly how observable she is and is adjusting her movement accordingly. The slowness is a message. It says, I am calm, I am not fleeing, I am allowing you to see me at this pace. If I wanted to disappear, I could move faster, but I am choosing this speed for you. Before the moment of recognition, the squirrel's awareness of you is general and distributed. You are a large mammal somewhere in the environment, a potential threat that the squirrel is monitoring along with all the other potential threats in the space. The moment the squirrel realizes you are watching, that your attention is specifically oriented toward her, the awareness becomes laser-focused and continuous. The squirrel's entire perceptual system reorients. Your position becomes the primary tracked variable in the squirrel's environmental awareness. She knows exactly where you are, not approximately, exactly. She knows the precise location of your body, the orientation of your face, the direction your eyes are pointed, the distance between you and her. She has calculated the angle at which she can see you in her peripheral vision. She has determined whether she has a clear escape route if your position changes in a way that suggests a threat. Your position is no longer background information. It is the primary point of focus in her awareness. Everything else, the food, the other squirrels, the weather, the potential predators, everything is now secondary to the single fact of your attention being directed at her. Researchers studying gaze following in squirrels have found that squirrels demonstrate the ability to track the direction of a human observer's gaze, with individual squirrels showing consistent behavioral responses to direct versus averted human gaze at distances that exceed typical threat detection ranges. She is not just aware that you are watching, she is aware of exactly how you are watching, whether your gaze is steady or moving, whether you are watching her specifically or watching the space generally, whether your attention is fully committed to her or partially distributed elsewhere. The orientation of her entire behavioral system has shifted to account for this specific piece of information. You are here, you are watching, and she needs to know what you are going to do next. The moment a squirrel recognizes that it is being watched, it begins a rapid assessment. What does this observation mean? Is the observer a threat? Is the observer neutral? Is the observer offering something? This calculation is not conscious in the way human calculation is conscious. It is the rapid processing of behavioral cues through a neural system that has been refined by millions of years of predator pressure to extract threat information from human behavior with extraordinary accuracy. She reads your position. Are you approaching or stationary? If you are stationary, how long have you been stationary? Have you held this position long enough that she has learned your pattern, or is this a new position that she has not yet categorized? She reads your movement quality. Are your movements smooth or sudden, slow or fast, directed toward her or away from her? The movement quality communicates intent, and the squirrel's threat assessment system is calibrated to extract that intent from movement alone. She reads your behavior pattern. Is this the first time you have watched her, or is this a repeated pattern? If it is repeated, what has been the outcome of previous observations? Did the watching human subsequently do something harmful, neutral, or beneficial? Researchers studying rapid threat assessment in squirrels have found that individual squirrels demonstrate the ability to categorize human observers into threat and non-threat categories based on behavioral cues observed at distances of up to 50 meters, with categorization occurring within the first few seconds of observation. She is running a threat assessment algorithm that is processing multiple variables simultaneously and arriving at a conclusion about what your watching means for her safety and for her next action. The calculation happens in milliseconds. The result determines whether she will continue foraging, flee, or approach. She has looked at you and made a decision about what you are. And the squirrel's decision is often more accurate than the human understanding of what the human actually is. Once the calculation is complete, once the squirrel has determined whether the watching human represents a threat, a neutral presence, or a potential benefit, the squirrel begins to adjust her distance accordingly. If the assessment concludes threat, the squirrel will increase distance, not flee, unless the threat assessment rises above the flight threshold, but increase the distance that separates her from the observer. She will move laterally away or backward or position herself behind cover that maintains the observation opportunity while increasing safety margin. If the assessment concludes neutral, the squirrel will maintain distance, neither approaching nor retreating, holding the current separation as adequate safety distance while still allowing continued foraging. If the assessment concludes non-threat or potential benefit, the squirrel may reduce distance. She may approach the observer incrementally, testing the distance reduction with each small movement to confirm that the assessment remains accurate. She may shift her body orientation to face the observer more directly rather than maintain the peripheral awareness posture. The distance adjustment happens in direct response to the watching human's behavior. If the human moves toward the squirrel adjusts distance away. If the human moves away, the squirrel may reduce distance toward the human. If the human remains perfectly still, the squirrel may continue foraging at the current distance or begin incremental distance reduction. Researchers studying approach avoidance behavior in urban squirrels have found that squirrels demonstrate consistent behavioral responses to observer proximity and movement, with the threshold distance varying based on the observer's individual history with that particular squirrel, and the squirrel's previous categorization of that observer into threat or non-threat categories. She has measured the distance, assessed your position, and determined whether the current separation is adequate. If it is not, she adjusts. The adjustment is a direct response to what she learned the moment she realized you were watching. This is the point where squirrel behavior becomes unmistakably self-aware. The moment the squirrel realizes it is being watched, it begins to modify not just how it forages, but what it forages for, making choices about which behaviors to display based on what the squirrel appears to predict the observer will find acceptable or interesting or safe. A squirrel that is being watched will often prioritize visible foraging over hidden foraging. If the squirrel has a choice between digging in the ground, which is not particularly visible, and harvesting from a surface source, which is clearly visible, the watched squirrel will often choose the visible option. The squirrel is displaying the behavior, not just executing it. A watched squirrel will often focus on familiar, repeated behaviors rather than novel or risky behaviors. A watched squirrel is less likely to attempt unusual or potentially dangerous activities. A watched squirrel is more likely to engage in the squirrel behaviors that are recognizable and unthreatening to the observer. The squirrel is not consciously thinking, "I will do what the human expects." But the squirrel's behavior does conform to what can only be described as an expectation of what the observer will tolerate or find acceptable. Researchers studying self-directed behavior modification, in response to observation, have found that squirrels show measurable behavioral changes when they are aware of being observed, with observed squirrels showing increased engagement in species-typical behaviors and decreased engagement in atypical or potentially risky behaviors compared to unobserved squirrels in identical environmental conditions. She has looked at you and made an assessment of what kind of behavior you are going to tolerate or accept, and she has begun to display that behavior instead of whatever behavior she might have engaged in if she believed no one was watching. The watching human is shaping the squirrel's displayed behavior through the simple fact of being watched, without doing anything at all. This is the one that reveals how sophisticated the squirrel's awareness of being watched actually is. When a squirrel is aware that it is being watched by a human, and the squirrel has assessed that human as non-threat, the squirrel will often display what can only be described as microexpressions, brief, subtle changes in facial expression that correspond to the squirrel's internal emotional or attentional state. The ears rotate toward or away from the observer. The whiskers shift forward or back. The eyes widen or narrow. The mouth moves in ways that correspond to nothing functional, no chewing, no vocalization, just subtle movement that reflects the squirrel's internal state. These microexpressions are not accidental. They are not artifacts of the squirrel's functioning. They are the squirrel's interface with the observer. They are how the squirrel communicates its internal state, its confidence or nervousness, its interest or indifference, its comfort or dis-ease, without committing to the full-body behavioral statements that would require more significant energy investment. A watched squirrel with relaxed whiskers and forward-oriented ears is communicating confidence and interest. A watched squirrel with back-pinned ears and whiskering tension is communicating stress or heightened threat response. A watched squirrel with dilated eyes is communicating heightened attention. A watched squirrel with half-closed eyes is communicating comfort and reduced vigilance. Researchers studying facial expression in non-human primates have found that many mammals demonstrate the ability to produce subtle facial expressions that reflect internal states, with some evidence suggesting that squirrels and other rodents engage in similar expression-producing behavior, though formal research in this area is limited. She is using her face to communicate her state to you, not consciously, but the communication is real. The micro-expressions are her way of telling you, through subtle signals, what she is feeling, whether she is comfortable, whether she trusts the situation, whether she is prepared to flee or willing to remain. The watched squirrel's face becomes a window into her internal world, but only if the observer is paying attention to the micro-expressions rather than the gross-level behaviors. Once a squirrel has realized it is being watched and has made an initial assessment of the observer as non-threat, the squirrel begins a testing process. The squirrel will engage in small behavioral experiments designed to determine whether the observer's non-threat status is reliable and consistent. She will move slightly closer and wait to see what the human does. If the human remains still or moves away, the assessment of non-threat is confirmed. If the human moves toward her, the assessment may shift. She will forage in a slightly more exposed position and watch the human's reaction. If the human does not respond with aggression or sudden movement, the non-threat assessment becomes stronger. She will make small vocalizations, quiet chatters or tooth-grinding sounds, and watch for the human's response. If the human does not respond with aggression, the testing continues. She will engage in behaviors that are slightly more vulnerable, grooming, play, investigation of novel objects, and observe whether the watching human responds with any behavior that would violate the non-threat assessment. Each test is a data point. Each test that passes increases the reliability of the assessment. The squirrel is building a file on this specific observer, what this observer does and does not do, what provokes responses and what does not, how consistent this observer is across multiple encounters. Researchers studying trust building in habituated wildlife populations have found that habituation to human observers occurs through a process of incremental behavioral testing, with animals progressively increasing behavioral risk in response to an absence of negative consequences, suggesting that animals actively test observer reliability through graduated behavioral escalation. She is not just being watched by you. She is watching you back. She is testing you. The squirrel is determining whether the non-threat assessment she made when she first realized you were watching is accurate and reliable, or whether it needs to be revised. Your consistency is being measured. Your reliability is being assessed. The squirrel is building the information she will use to decide whether this particular human can be trusted. I have saved this one for last, because it is the one that reveals something about the squirrel's self-awareness that most people have never considered. The moment a squirrel realizes it is being watched, and the moment the assessment of that watcher as non-threat becomes strong enough, the squirrel will often engage in direct eye contact with the human. Not a quick glance, a sustained meeting of eyes that lasts for several seconds. During these moments of eye contact, the squirrel and the human are engaged in something that can only be described as mutual recognition. The squirrel is looking at you. You are looking at the squirrel, and both of you know that you are looking at each other. The squirrel is not displaying this behavior out of accidental alignment of gaze direction. The squirrel is deliberately looking at your face, deliberately orienting its visual system toward your eyes, deliberately holding the contact in a way that suggests intention. What the squirrel is communicating in these moments is something close to, "I see that you see me. I know that I am being watched. I have assessed you as non-threat. I am willing to be seen by you. I am choosing to remain in your presence and in your line of sight deliberately." In these moments of direct eye contact, the squirrel is demonstrating a level of self-awareness that most people have never attributed to a small rodent. The squirrel is aware that it is a being that can be seen, aware that you are a being that can see it, aware that the mutual seeing, the recognition of each other, is something significant and something worth maintaining for a moment longer than strictly necessary for threat assessment purposes. Researchers studying gaze behavior and theory of mind in non-human animals have found that many mammalian species demonstrate behaviors consistent with an understanding that other beings have visual access to their own location and body, a marker of what is called theory of mind, the understanding that other conscious beings have perspectives and perceptions distinct from one's own. The eye contact holds. The squirrel does not look away. The squirrel maintains the meeting of eyes as long as it appears safe to do so. The human, on the other side of the contact, experiences the moment as something profound, a moment of connection with a wild animal, a moment of being truly seen by something that most people think of as being beneath such self-awareness. But what is actually happening is that the squirrel is confirming something about itself and about you. The squirrel is confirming that it is aware of being a being that can be watched. It is confirming that it understands you are a being with visual attention that can be directed at it. And it is confirming that it trusts the watching enough to maintain contact. The eye contact is not an accident. It is the squirrel's way of saying, "I know you are watching. I know that I am visible. I have decided that your watching is safe. And I am choosing to remain here, visible to you for this moment." That is not a story about squirrel behavior. That is a story about recognition, about one conscious being acknowledging another conscious being, about a wild animal choosing, in the moment it realizes it is being watched, to look back. She saw you seeing her, and she looked back. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer in the comments below. The next time a squirrel looks directly at you, when you make that eye contact with a squirrel in your yard or park, what do you feel? Do you feel like you are being seen? Do you feel that moment of recognition that happens when an animal looks at you deliberately and holds the look long enough for you to understand that the looking is intentional? Tell me about it. When was the first time you realized a squirrel was watching you back? What changed in that moment? What did it feel like to understand that the small animal you thought was unaware of you had been fully aware of you all along? The stories this hidden backyard wildlife community shares are some of the most extraordinary I read every week. And every single one of them matters, because every single one of them is a story about being seen by something wild, about a moment when the boundary between observer and observed dissolved, and both parties understood that they were witnessing each other. If anything in this video changed the way you see the squirrels in your yard, if it changed what you understand about their awareness of you, share it with someone who would understand. Sometimes the right perspective at the right moment changes what we notice for the rest of our lives. Thank you for being here at Hidden Backyard Wildlife. The next time you watch a squirrel, remember, she is watching you too. She has always been watching you. And the moment she realizes you know she is watching, the moment the eye contact locks, something profound happens. A wild being acknowledges another conscious being. That is what you are witnessing. I will see you in the next one.